tracking down Pete Sussick out by the bus more than once before Marshfield got on a bus to go back to Coos Bay. So fond memories. I left Eugene in the late 80s and came up to Seattle and worked at both newspapers up here. The Seattle Post-Intelligencer, before it no longer exists. And I think I can say with some certainty, I don't think I had anything to do with putting it out of business, but some may argue with that. But anyway, the balance of my career was spent working at both Seattle dailies. Probably, I'd say 95% of the stuff I covered, both in Eugene and Seattle, was college football and college basketball. And I've joked in the past that at some point the good Lord took me aside and said, "Bud, you're going to be able to cover some really good college basketball," and sounded pretty good. And then in the next breath, he said, "But to do that, you're going to have to cover some really, really bad college football." And he was true to his word. I got to cover some, just terrific college hoops. I calculated when I retired, and I think it's pretty close, that if you consider, you have 3 weekends in each NCAA basketball tournament, and of course 2 rounds per weekend. And I calculated I covered 73 weekends of the NCAA tournament in I don't know, 35 or 40 years, I guess. And that included 20 Final Fours, which were great fun. Just the tournament is annually so good, and it's hard to even think of one that didn't live up to expectations. And then at some point it dawned on me that not only that, but I'd been blessed to be able to say that I covered, on at least a semi-regular basis, 2 different Northwest teams that reached number 1 in the wire service polls. The first was Oregon State back in 1981 under Ralph Miller. And then the second one was Gonzaga in 2013. And of course, Gonzaga has been back up there 2 or 3 times and is currently ranked number 1 in the country. But as for that football I mentioned, that was the other part of the deal. As some of you know, the 70s and 80s were pretty rugged times, both at Oregon and Oregon State. I covered Oregon State for a year or 2 right after I got to Eugene, and then swung over to the Oregon football beat, and saw some pretty lean times in both those programs, including the infamous 0-0 tie back in 1983, which I'm sure many of you have heard about if you didn't witness it yourself. There were a lot of other bleak football times that I was associated with. Covered the Paul Wolf era at Washington State up here for the Seattle Times. That was 10, 12 years ago. And that was really lean times. And some of you may be aware that in 2008, Washington went 0-12. And I think I can say pretty definitively I had nothing to do with that, although there are probably some people who believe that just me being in the area might have had something to do with Washington going winless. But anyway, it was all great fun. Even the losing teams that I covered, there were good times associating with good people and whatnot. It does make it a lot easier when the team you're following is winning. Everything just seems to make sense when that's the case. But when they're not, you have a lot of people questioning a lot of things, and sometimes they're questioning what you're writing. So that just sort of comes with the territory. But anyway, So I'm here to talk about the book that I just did, and here's what it looks like if you haven't seen it. It's called Mad Hoops, and it is a chronicle of the University of Oregon basketball program in the 1970s under Dick Harter. Harter had, in 1971, Oregon changed coaches, and very uncharacteristic of Oregon, because the Ducks had always kind of done things on the cheap. They went and hired this coach who had been eminently successful for 2 years back at the University of Pennsylvania. And they paid good money at the time, which they were not renowned for doing. And so Dick Harter came out here to the West with the express purpose of trying to dethrone UCLA and John Wooden. And of course, that didn't happen, and it was a pretty lofty, unrealistic goal. But he did beat Wooden one time. Wooden, of course, retired in 1975, halfway through Harter's tenure at Oregon. But Harter sort of established his own currency at Oregon with he was an ex-Marine who had a philosophy that you might expect of an ex-Marine. He preached really rugged man-to-man defense, very physical, very grabby, frankly, the way they played defense. He wanted, anytime there was a loose ball on the floor, he wanted Oregon to have it, and they practiced. They had loose ball drills. He would, I don't know if they did this every day. I saw him practice a handful of times. I was not the Oregon basketball beat writer. I was actually the beat writer at Oregon State at the time, which made it interesting. But they had a drill that was pretty common, where Harter would stand under a basket, and they would station a player on each side of the key, and he'd roll the ball through the key, and they'd have to dive on it. And basically, your opponent there, quote unquote, you'd have to beat him for the ball. And of course, it was no holds barred. You basically had to out wrestle the other guy for the ball. And I think I can be fairly confident in saying there was blood spilled in some of those skirmishes, and probably stitches incurred as well. It was really, practices were really rugged. They had another drill for taking defensive charges, in which you can imagine 8 or 10 guys lined up, just in a single file line, and one guy facing him, a few feet away, or maybe more than a few feet, actually. And the first guy in the 8 or 10 line would run full bore into the guy who would have to accept a charge and come crashing down to the floor and get up again and do it again for the next guy in the line. They would just do this repeatedly. About midway through Harter's tenure, he hit upon the idea of making it even more grueling. He introduced, some of you may be familiar with it's an old drill that I'm sure basically probably still done at the high school and college level even today, defensive slides, where the defender goes back and forth with his arms outstretched, basically in position to defend the offensive player. And they can be very grueling, even in the best of times. But Harter introduced this idea of having the defensive players hold bricks in each hand, which of course made it even more exhausting. And they would go for, as I'm told by the players back then, they would go for half hour or 45 minutes straight with holding these bricks at various angles. They wouldn't just do it at 90-degree angles to the floor. They hold them up like this, and they would, the other arm would go up, but both hands would be holding these bricks, and it would become just incredibly exhausting. And then the other thing that he implemented at about that same time was the rope climb. He had a couple of heavy duty ropes affixed to a catwalk at Old MacArthur Court in Eugene. And toward the end of practice, when players were typically they were like 3-hour practices. So these guys would just be gassed at the end of practice, and he would require guys to scale these ropes. So I don't know what height that would be, maybe 30 feet or whatever, up to this catwalk where the rope was affixed, and then go back down. And so there was all sorts of things, anything diabolical he could come up with to make things more difficult for his guys, he would do. And at the same time, it's hard to even describe the mania in Eugene for the program after it got going about the second year. The Ducks were just beloved in Eugene, and of course in parts of Oregon. Ducks tended to love the program, and everybody else tended to hate them for their tactics and for the physical play and so forth. But the intensity of the love for them in Eugene was just off the charts. They began to sell out Mac Court, I think, about the second year of the program, and sold it out, I believe, all the way through the rest of Harder's tenure, which carried through 1978. It was just crazy. It was the kind of thing where Oregon season tickets began to be really coveted, and they began to show up in wills, probate agreements and so forth, and divorce settlements. It was not uncommon to see, she'll get the tickets and I'll get the car, that type of thing. So it was just a really, really intense time. As I say, there was a lot of antipathy out there for the way Oregon played, and especially up and down the old Pac-8 conference. John Wooden at UCLA was outspoken in his disdain for the tactics and for the style of play. Marv Harshman, who would become a Hall of Fame coach at Washington, he was outspoken about it. Marv was always outspoken about pretty much everything, and he definitely was. And there was just as much love for the Ducks as there was in Eugene. There was pretty much equal part disdain for them around on the West Coast. You've probably heard of Bobby Knight at Indiana, the legendary coach back there who was very successful and also very controversial. And I tend to describe Harder as Bob Knight without the trophies. He didn't have nearly the success Knight had, but he was a pretty similar personality, very mercurial, and he would do things seemingly without thinking before. He was an interesting character in that he had high standards for his players in terms of he wanted good, solid guys. And when they went on the road, he wanted, they wore sport coats. Can't remember whether neckties were required, but I know they wore sport coats. And he wanted them to present themselves in the best possible way. But at the same time, Harder would do things himself. His personal life was kind of a mess, which I get into in some detail in the book. And and he would get embroiled in various incidents, some of which people's jaws drop when you talk about them today, and that will lead me into really how the book came about, or how what the seed was for me thinking about a book. One of these weird, harder misadventures happened in 1974 at Gill Coliseum in Corvallis, when he tripped an Oregon State male cheerleader on purpose. The genesis of all this was there was a trophy back in the day called the Chancellor's Trophy, which was supposed to reflect which school won the season series between the two. They would play the two conference games in about, I don't know, 73, 74. They also played a single non-league game, which didn't count in the standings. They played in Portland. And so whoever won the season series would claim the Chancellor's Trophy for a year and get to put it in their trophy case until the next year. And so anyway, Oregon State, this was the final game in 1974, which was Harder's third year. And Oregon State, it was the final minute of the game. Oregon State had the game wrapped up well in hand, and Oregon State was going to, it was going to be 2 out of 3. They were going to win the Chancellor's Trophy. And so Jim Barrett, who was the Oregon State athletic director at the time, had the trophy sort of off in the wings there, and took it. Somebody had taken it out of the trophy case, and he gave it to a cheerleader named Rick Cooten, and told him to present it to Ralph Miller, the head coach, when the game was over. And so it's now just seconds to go, and there's a dead ball situation. And as Rick Cooten, who I met up with in Corvallis for the book a 3 years ago, explained, he said, "Gee, what sense did it make to go give this trophy to Ralph, who didn't really care about it anyway? What sense did it make to do that? The crowd's going to be filing out. Most people aren't even going to see this. This makes no sense." So after Barrett gave Cooten the trophy, he decided the fans needed to see this trophy and sort of exult in the moment. And so Rick began to jog around the perimeter of the court. Keep in mind, it was a dead ball situation. They were probably setting up to shoot free throws. Anyway, he began to jog around the perimeter of the court, holding the trophy up to the fans and whatnot. And, everybody's whooping it up and whatnot at Gill Coliseum. And so toward the end of that route around the floor, that carried him in front of the Oregon bench. And it was there that Harder stuck out his leg and tripped Rick Cooten intentionally, which it's pretty mind bending. So anyway, he Harder apologized, sent him a short letter of apology, which Rick still has, and which I reproduced in the book. And it was kind of that incident related to that incident that really got me thinking about doing this book. I happened to be in Corvallis a few years ago, 2016, for a Washington State, Oregon State football game. Just went down, pleasure trip. My wife has a lot of family down there. And so I got together with some old friends the morning of the game for breakfast. And one in the group of 5 was Rick Cooten, the cheerleader, who I had known sort of passingly over the years, but we hadn't kept, in touch or anything like that. And so as we're sitting there having our pancakes and our eggs and so forth, I said, "Rick, you got to tell us about the night Dick Harder tripped you." And so Rick was only too glad to do that. And he, in great detail, he recounted that story. And so that sort of launched all of us. We all had, we were all there during the harder years and so forth. And that sort of launched all of us into telling Dick Harder stories. And you know, I sort of began thinking, boy, it's such a wild, chaotic, controversial era that a book might really fly. I had done a few books previously, and that really kind of launched the idea right there. As far as you know, what might have surprised me in researching the book or producing the book, one of the real delightful things, frankly, was you know, when you get the idea to do a book like this, and you're thinking, okay, how's it going to work? You know, what do I need to do? You know, you have no idea where people are, if they're still living, you know, how easy they're going to be to get a hold of, et cetera, et cetera. And I always like to, if possible, and I think pretty much any writer would tell you this, preferably you'd like to get with the person in person, face to face, rather than deal with them over the phone, if you can. And so it was a great surprise, I guess you'd say, to find out that, you know, most of those ex-players live in the Northwest. They were easily reachable. I'd say 75% of them that I interviewed, I was able to get with in person. And then even more than that, there were a lot of former Oregon administrators and the athletic director at that time. I was able to get with him down in Eugene. Several assistant and associate athletic directors were, you know, still living and more than happy to talk about the book. So it was really gratifying to get with these people and not have to piece stories together around, which always leaves you room for error or whatever if you do that, or leaves you liable to make errors. And it was so much better to be able to do all this in person. So anyway, that's about all I have. The only other thing I wanted to make sure you're aware of is there's always a question, you know, let's say you want to buy the book or you want to give it for a Christmas present or whatever. The question always comes up, you know, can I get a signed copy? Well, you know, it becomes difficult because then you've got to buy the book, you've got to incur the expense to get it in the mail. I got to do the same thing going back. And so my wife worked up a pretty cool workaround here. These are all the same. They're labels. They're about 4 or 5 inches. The photograph is of the preeminent player of that era, Ronnie Lee, diving on the floor naturally enough. And the way this would work is I can provide my email address if you wanted a signed copy or even personalized copy, you know, to a friend, a son, a daughter, whatever. I can do that, and I'll slip it in the mail to you. You slap it on an inside page of the book, and you've got a signed copy. And if you like the label, I'm asking that you stick $5 in the mail just for the design and the materials and mailing costs and whatnot. So anyway, it's kind of a nice way to get around the issue of you know, having to send the book back and forth.
Hey, Bud, what's your email? I'll just put it in the chat section here.
Yeah, that'd be great. It's Casa Budman, CASA, like Spanish for house, CASABUDMAN @gmail.com. CasaBudman@gmail.com. And you know, I can get, you know, if you want to do that, I can certainly get them out and get them to you in time for Christmas. So.
All right, I put that in the chat if anybody wants to grab that, or if you missed that today, you can drop me an email and I can make sure I get that out to you. But we have a little bit of time left. If anybody has any questions, I'll put it into gallery view so I can see everybody. Does anybody have any questions for Bud? I had one question that I had on a follow-up then would be, in terms of as you said, like the harder era, do you, what happened after that? Just for my sake, not being from the Northwest, was there a counter movement after, Dick Harder left U of O? Did they kind of move back towards how they were doing things before, or?
Yeah, well, let me attack it with two parts. He left in 1978 to go back to Penn State, which was kind of a curious move because Penn State then and now is pretty much a football school, and the basketball job has never been seen as any kind of a plum job. But I think his star had just sort of flamed out in Eugene after a while. He was a guy who was inevitably just going to wear people out after a while. And I think that's what happened. But so he leaves, and they name Jim Haney the head coach. Jim was 29 years old at the time. It seems even crazier now than it did then, I think. He had played for Harder at Pennsylvania, late 60s, early 70s, and he had never coached anywhere other than under Harder for a few years at Oregon, and he gets named head coach, and it had become apparent to him toward the end of the Harder era, obviously, that the style was just too exclusive in terms of recruits. I mean, there were too many recruits who didn't want to play that style, and so literally the first thing Haney said when he took over for Harder after Harder had left was, of course, the nickname of the team was the Kamikaze Kids, and I may have neglected to say that along the way. I shouldn't have. But he said something to the effect that the Kamikaze Kids era is over, and you'll never hear that term around Oregon basketball again. And so he tried to make a real clean break with that style and with those tactics, and it really didn't work. Almost inevitably it didn't work. I mean, he was too young for the job, for one thing, and they struggled. They rather than continue some of the defensive prowess that the Hard, at least in a cleaner, so to speak, way, rather than do that, they basically began playing no defense and began to be more of a run up and down the floor kind of team, and it just didn't work. And so 5 years after that, he resigned, and he actually went on to a very successful career with the National Association of Basketball Coaches, kind of the quote unquote union, I guess you'd say, for basketball coaches, and just retired within the last year. But I think he was really more cut out for an administrative type role than coaching.
Tim, I have a question.
Yeah, Bill, go ahead.
Can I ask one? Bud, you have an amazing appreciation for the game. Did you play basketball as a younger man?
Just pickup ball. I mean, I loved. At one time we lived in Ohio when I was in junior high school, and our church was like, we walked out the back door and it was right down the alley. It was literally like a half a block away, and they had a little gym in there, and I loved to go in there. And especially would go in there on Saturday morning, and there'd be older kids in there, and sometimes even college kids, and but I never played competitively. Just kind of loved to write about the game and to write about sports.
Well, that's great. Your description of those workouts reminds me of why 1 year of college basketball was more than I was able to keep up with.
Yeah, it was brutal, no doubt about it. And the thing about Harder was, I addressed this in the book, he became more and more entrenched in the belief that was the right way to do it. pardon me, he came out to the West where the style has always been associated with finesse. And I think he, especially when he began to get criticism from people like John Wooden, he thought, okay, I'll show you. It was really that mentality, and he doubled down on it, really, and it just became more and more crazy. I cited a number in the book where one of his I can't remember which year, but they set the record for personal fouls during one year during his tenure, and it's something like 830, and the year before he got there it was like 490 or something. They fouled and fouled and fouled. They used to have I don't want to drone on too long for you folks, but they used to have a kind of a belief that if the other team had a really good center, like there was James Edwards at the University of Washington, who went on to a fairly lengthy pro career. He was a 7-footer. Oregon didn't have anybody who was like that, but what they would have is like three guys, 6'9", 6'10", 6'11", and they would basically just beat on this guy for 35 minutes. And if their belief was, hey, we got 15 fouls and the other guys only got 5, and they would get. This sounds crazy, but I ran across one case where one of their centers fouled out late in the first half. They would use these fouls just profusely with the idea that, hey, the other guy's going to commit fouls in retaliation if we play a really physical game, and oftentimes it worked that way.
Do you remember Daryl Imhoff?
I know the name really well. Really at Cal, right?
Yeah, he was a walk-on at Cal, and they used to call him the Axe. Retired NBA player, never made more than $50,000 in the NBA. But I bring him up because he died a couple of years ago from a heart attack. He's a past president of Springfield Rotary Club. Wonderful guy. I think he was like 6'10" or 11.
Yeah. I know the name well, and I know he played for Pete Newell and won a national title, didn't he, down there I know
he had Jerry West was a roommate. Had his picture on a box of Wheaties, and he auctioned that off one year at the club's fundraiser.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Well, Bud, Tom's got a question for you, and then we'll have to move into Rotary business, and we'd like you to stick around if you could, Bud. But Tom, go ahead and ask your question.
Just a quick comment, Bob. I officiated basketball for a number of years, and I had James Edwards in a varsity game at Garfield. I believe he was Garfield High School, but he was actually I also refereed him when he was in junior high, and he was 6'10" then.
No kidding. Wow. Yeah, he was a load.
Yeah.
All right, guys. Thank you again. Let's give Bud a big round of applause, virtually, of course. But thank you so much, Bud. That was outstanding. I really appreciate that program, and I'm going to go ahead and stop the record at this point.